I've said before, is just track the parallel argument that he's making, parallel set of arguments that he's making with respect to quality, qualitative existence here. Think about what it is for something to be real, and we can track that through in this way. You end up in qualitative infinity, the two forms that we've talked about. I'm obviously summarizing here, and then that gets you to being for itself, which is the conclusion of that. That's the attraction-repulsion claim, and that leads you in, as we know, to this, to quantity. So that's actually the linear way in which it works, but what he's asserting here is that both of them come together in this moment because they transition into one another, they entail one another in measures. So we see quantity as magnitude, discrete and continuous as number, extensive, intensive. This is degree in here, by the way, I didn't put it in here with degrees in here. And then you get quantitative infinity, then you get quantitative ratio proportion. That last bit about the ratio of powers is where you get the quantitative infinity, and now he's telling us that works through, or entails measure. Now, the thing I always find, so let's just, I think it's always helpful to kind of stop at these moments and think for a second about what's going on here, right? He is literally saying to us, quality entails quantity, quantity entails quality. That's literally what he's saying, so I just want to be clear about that. And a lot of us at that point would go, okay, well then what that's going to mean is that they're going to have a, if we kind of have our standard Hegel caricature about us, we would say, okay, well, if they entail one another, then they probably have some, larger subsuming concept that brings them both in. And that's what measure is, or that's what essence is, and that's just not the case, right? So I want to kind of disabuse us of that notion, because it's just not how Hegel works, ever. So here what you see him say is that measure names, right? Measure names, the interdependence of them, the transition of one into the other. Just like, you want to get a comparison here that might help you, measure is just like becoming, right? Becoming names being transitioning into nothing, nothing transitioning into being. It just names, it's not some third concept that subsumes being and nothing within it. It just is the name for that vanishing of one into the other. Well, here you have the transition of quality into quality, quantity into quality, much more determinate than being and nothing is, right, obviously. But they entail one another, they transition into one another, and measure names that. So let's walk through this for just a second. So again, 279, second full paragraph, 320 in the German. So the first claim he makes is quantity is the truth of quality. Quantity is the truth of quality. He just reminds you of, that's the big argument I made to move from quality into quantity. So he says, at first quantity as such thus appears in opposition to quality, but quantity is itself a quantity, self-related determinate as such, differentiated from its other determinateness, which is its other, from quality as such, except that quantity is not only a quality, rather the truth of quality itself is quantity. And quantity has demonstrated itself as transition or passing over into it. We'll come back to that last bit, but he's just reminding you, look, if you look at quality, quality necessarily entails quantity. Quantity is the truth of quality. Then the second claim, quality is the truth of quantity. So here's the reversal of that. Quantity in its truth is instead the externality that has returned into itself, and that's in the proportion of powers, right? That's the ratio of powers, that's what that really is. Which is no longer indifferent. This, thus, is quality itself in such a way that outside this determination, quality as such would yet not be anything at all. So there's that line, as I point out several times, of to be real, you have to be a discrete entity, right? But to be a discrete entity is to be real, right? That's what those things entail one another. So then he just pulls that all together. For the totality is posited, made explicit, but also produces both of these moments. So the whole, what is this whole? This could be a process, as we'll see. Right? For the totality is posited, a double transition or passing over, Übergang is the term he's using here. It's the same exact term he used in the being nothing, passing over to one another, transitioning to one another. This is the same language as becoming. He says, for the totality is posited, a double transition or passing over is required. Not only the transition of one determinist into the other, but equally the transition of this other into the first. It's going back into it. Through the first transition, the identity of the two is present at first only in itself. Quality is contained in quantity, but the latter, quantity is still only a one-sided determinist. Quality is contained in quantity. But then we see that conversely, that quantity is equally contained in quality. That it is equally also only a sublatent. This results in the second transition, the going back into the first. So quantity is contained in quality. Quantum is henceforth, that's that line on 280. It stands forth no longer as an indifferent or external determination, but is sublated as such, and it is a quality, and that by virtue of which anything is what it is, the truth of quantum is to be measured. So measure, then, is the concept that names the reciprocal dependent relationship of quantity and quality. It is nothing other than the relationality of these two fundamental forms of determinateness. Now, if that makes some sense, then I think you can begin to see what he means when he talks about measure. Because I want to highlight really two things out of this discussion of measure. There's a ton more here that I'm going to be able to cover. It's very complex, dark waters here, a lot of interesting stuff about elective affinities and all sorts of wonderful things we could talk about. I'm going to isolate and focus on really two claims that he makes in the measure section that I think are pivotal for the section, but also pivotal for where the entirety of the doctrine of being goes. We're going to focus on the first one today. We'll focus on the second one next time. So here's the two claims. The first one is to say, to be real, to be qualitatively determined, that is to be real, is to be an entity, that is to be discrete, to be quantitatively determined. And to be an entity is to be measured. So as he says on 280, the truth of quantum is to be measured. The truth of quantum is to be measured. So we just want to figure out, what does it mean to say that measure is the truth of quantum? Right? How does that work? What does that entail? What does that look like? So that's the thing we're going to focus on today. But then he says on, flip over to this, on 337, so at the end of this discussion, or actually the beginning of the doctrine of essence, I would say. He makes this other claim, that to be measured is to be determined by essence. Now that's a pretty amazing claim, right? It's not just that quality and quantity measure one another, which is the first claim, right? We'll try to make sense of what that means. But he's going to say that entails that we're going to have to move to a different domain, that we're going to have to move out of the domain of being, because being is going to be fully and completely determined as measure and its measurelessness. So that's going to entail now that complete determination, but also the transition to something other than it, essence. Now you'll say, well, you know, Kevin, we're in philosophy, we've been dealing with essences for years, like, thousands. So what's the big deal here? Well, Hegel wants to say, unlike our good friend Socrates, who used to run around to people and say, oh, you seem to know what justice is. Please tell me what the essence of justice is. As though essences were just things you could grasp. Hegel wants to actually show the imminent and necessary entailment of essence from being itself. That being entails necessarily essence. And it entails it as its ground. It entails it as its ground. This is retrogressive ground. Essence will be the ground of being. And that would mean that being will have to be understood not as being, but as shine, what you would normally translate as illusory being. Right? It won't work that way quite in Hegel, we'll talk about why. But shine is the term you see in the first critique in Hegel, S-C-H-E-I-N. This is the term you would see in the first critique by Hegel, by Kant, that means what the dialectic produces is illusions, right? Produces shine. Hegel picks up on that word and says, I like that word, because it means illusory, flimsy surface, but it also means how something shines through it. He thinks essences appear. They shine through being. So we'll come back to that, try to make some sense of that, but how do you even get to another dimension, right? If you think about the doctrine of being as being a very flat, austere ontology, then how do you entail, however you want to think about essence as being more fundamental or higher than, how do you get something like that out of this account? How can it imminently and necessarily entail moving to a different level, a different stratum itself? That'll be the question we'll take up next week. His claim is that because it's measureless, it entails that. Precisely because being is unable to determine itself ultimately. For all this determination, all the qualitative and quantitative determination, all the measuring that it does of itself, it's ultimately incapable of determining itself. And it determines itself through something that's beyond itself. Yes. More about that next week. So let's ask two questions. What is measure? And then why does measure become essence? The why does measure become essence we'll deal with next week. Let's deal with this week, just what the hell is this thing called measure? Mass. His claim, I think this is always a good place to start, is that to be measure is to be measureless. To be measure is to be measureless. It's not a failure of being measured, right? Just like to be quantity is to be quantitatively infinite. It's not a failure to be quantity. To be quality is to be qualitatively infinite. It's not a failure to be quality. It's to be those things. It's to be what those things are. It's not as though infinity, qualitative, quantitative, or measuring infinity, stands outside. It's not as though the measure stands above and beyond being. No, it's in being itself. But to be measure is of its own accord, of its own self, necessarily other than itself. And because it others itself, it's measureless. Well, how does that work? So measure is the necessary interrelation, we could say the proportion, between quantity and quality now. Remember the ratios, the proportions were between quanta. Here it's the relationship between qualitative determination and quantitative determination. Qualitative determination, quantitative determination. That's the difference between measure and ratio. And it's that by virtue of which anything is, any entity is what it is. We have seen that at least initially at the most abstract and least concrete layer of being, qualitative and quantitative determinacy are separable. That's the way we first encountered them. They're separable from one another. Something is qualitatively, that means the qualitative determinacy of something is what marks it as classifiable as real, as existent, or not, non-existent, so reality or negation. In order to be real, in order to possess the quality or attribute of reality, we could say, something must be by virtue of a self-relational structure, being for self, infinity. Something is itself, in itself, by being other than itself, being for itself. That's what we learned. That's ultimately what the oneness, the manyness, the repulsion, attraction, for itselfness of being is. Qualitatively. Something is quantitatively, what does that mean? The quantitative determinacy of something is what marks it as measurable. Use that in a general term. We'll come back and use it in a very specific sense right now. But it means that you can count it, right? Count it. As being of a specific, discrete magnitude. But in order to be discrete, in order to possess a definite magnitude, something must be that by virtue of a self-relational structure again, infinity now understood in terms of proportionality between the quanta. Something is itself by being other than itself, and itself by being for itself. On the analysis thus far, then, something can be what it is qualitatively, that is real, and yet it may increase or decrease in extensive amount or intensive unit, magnitude, and still be what it is. Quality and quantity are, again, at this preliminary level, indifferent to one another. So if you stopped us before this, you would say, you can do qualitative determination, something's real. You can do quantitative determination, something's got a magnitude, and they really don't have that much to do with one another. They're, basic determinations of being, but they're not, implied in one another. We now know better than that, right? We've reached a stage in which they actually entail one another, but you would enter them saying, well, magnitude and reality are, related, but they're not necessary for one another. It could be a content. That's the way Kant thinks of them. Right? They're both categories of the understanding, and therefore categories of the conditions of the possibility of experience, but do they really have anything to do with one another? I don't know. The logic told us different, so let's do it this way. I'm paraphrasing massively, but not that much. But quantitative determination, that is magnitude, has shown itself to be what it is as for healthiness, as proportion, as relation. That is, magnitude is nothing other than the relation between distinct quanta. That is the contradiction between distinctness and continuity. And what being a ratio shows is that what makes magnitude what it is its becoming other. It's surpassing of itself by differing from itself. It's raising of itself to a higher and higher multiples of itself. Exponential ratio. It follows from this then that the two types of determinacy, qualitative and quantitative determinacy, actually cannot be separated. For quality has proven to be quantity, and quantity has proven to be quality. Measure is the category that names the reciprocal interdependence of them. As he says, the very first line on 282, so back up now to 282. Very beginning of the measure chapter. He writes, just in case you didn't get this from that crazy argument on 279, a crazy review of the argument thus far in the book. First line, abstractly expressed, quality and quantity are in measure united. Well, we always get really excited about the united part. We think, oh yeah, they've been brought together, all is happiness, all is reconciled. He said abstractly expressed for a reason. Because what he's about to unpack is how they're not so united in this any kind of simplistic identity way. I know we love to say for Hegel that once you get two opposites united with one another, they form an identity. Oh, isn't that precious and wonderful? It's actually not how Hegel ever works. I wish it were that simple. Right? That would be a lot better. Simpler, at least, not better for account of the way reality is. But it'd be better a lot if that actually did work that way, because then, Hegel would fall prey to a lot of the critiques about him, and it'd be a lot simpler to be able to figure out these damn things. But he says abstractly express quality and quantity is what measure are, and is that in which measure are united. But what does that really mean? In what sense are they united? Well, I want to focus on what he says on 318. So I'm skipping a lot of stuff here, but I think it's worth it to do this, and that's to look at this kind of culmination of how do you think the measuring of quality and quantity with respect to one another, how the qualitative determination, how are they, in what sense are they united, right? And what united will turn out to mean is they measure one another. They set the limit to one another. That's what it means, right? They set the limit to one another. So they're not integrated, reconciled, and harmonious bliss with one another. They're actually constantly trying to set the boundary, the circumference, the scope beyond which the other can't get. And yet, of course, it does. So he talks about this in a number of different ways. He first starts saying, well, quality and quantity are, we have to think about this, it's a relation, so they're indifferent to one another, but they're indifferently related. That's what elective affinity is, right? That's just where they happen to be in relationship to one another because of something we can't understand about how they're actually related. That's the affinity of them, but it doesn't really have any generative property, any generativity to the relationship itself. They happen to come into constellations, configurations, what we would call in other contexts an extrinsic relation to one another. But we know that that's not true to what they are. That's like direct ratio. Right? They're association with one another, but you really haven't thought to negativity yet. Well, this image he gives us here on 318 and following, 364 and following in the German, what he calls the nodal lines of measure relations is, as far as I can tell, Hegel really trying to tell you about how the intrinsic relationality, the negative relationality of quality and quantity with respect to one another, how they measure one another, how they set the limit on one another, really needs to be thought. So take a look on 319 at the bottom. The last paragraph on 319, this is 365 in the German. Look at what he gives you here. We'll look at a couple of these passages because he gives this a couple of different times. And I will try, right, and please bear with me, to illustrate it, right? And not only will my drawing be horrible, but the idea, right, what I'll try to illustrate with may be horrible as well. So here he says, here we have a measure relation. All right, measure relation is quality, quantity. A self-subsistent reality that is qualitatively distinguished from others. Qualitatively distinct. So in its reality, it's distinct. Such a being for self, because it is at the same time essentially a relation of quanta, quality and quantity relation to one another, is open to externality and to quantitative alteration. Did you catch that? Qualitative being for self is now open to quantitative alteration. Change the quantity, it's going to change the quality. That's what he's just said. Change the quantity. That's not just going to be indifferent to the qualitative state. It's going to change it. It's going to have an impact on it. They're negatively related to one another, so they're going to have an impact on one another. So he says, it has such a being for self, because it is at the same time essentially a relation to quanta, is open to externality and to quantitative alteration. Because quality is necessarily quantity, it's going to be open to quantitative change, alteration. It has a range within which it remains indifferent to this alteration, that is to say, the qualitative state perdures, it sustains. But then there comes a point on the progression in the alteration, in the quantitative alteration, where it changes. The qualitative self-relation changes. Now you're not talking about qualitative alteration, nor quantitative alteration. You're talking about both together and how they actually force one another to be that. So now you're realizing, oh my God, that qualitative change that we were talking about, all this is about becoming, right? How does becoming happen? Becoming happens because endemic to quality and quantitative determinacy is infinity. And infinity overturns any kind of self-relation, be it qualitative or quantitative. And now you've got to see, oh my God, they actually work in relationship to one another. When one changes, for a long time it doesn't matter, maybe. But then it does. So you have a line, quantitative continuity, and you have knots on it of qualitative change. This is the nodal line that he talks about here. You have a line, think of that as the quantitative continuity, constantly changing, right? Because constantly going up and going down. That's what the nature of, we've learned, that's what the nature of quantitativeness is, and that's what the quantitative change is all about. It's constantly surpassing itself, going beyond itself. So it's going to rise and it's going to decline. Fine, wonderful, great, good. Does that not do anything to quality? Yeah, it certainly does. It changes quality. Immediately? No, it changes it after a certain point on the line. So that knots are the qualitative transformation. He says, but there enters a point in this quantitative alteration at which the quality is changed. Quality is changed. And the quantum shows itself as specifying. Specifying is his term for as measuring it, right? So here, you want to see where quantity measures quality? Right there. Quantity measures it when it gets too much of it, too little of it, so that the qualitative state that it's in relation to is forced to change in some kind of way, form, fashion, or another. That's where you get the measuring of quantity by quality. Quantity by quality. He says, so that the altered qualitative relation is converted into a measure, and thus into a new quality. Okay, now wait a minute. It's a new quality, so now it's the measure of the quantity that's changed. It's literally setting the circumference of, okay, this new quantitative point we've reached, it's now defined as this. So quantitative change leads to qualitative change, but qualitative change then becomes the new measure for quantitative change. Here's my very bad examples. And they are always with the caution of, I'm about to give natural examples of ontological phenomena, so they come with all the, the cautions of, well, isn't this true of that? And isn't that true of that? And it's not true necessarily at the ontological level, so I tread here carefully. But I think we need examples of this, so let me try to make some examples. Let's talk about water. Let's talk about heating it sufficiently, it becomes steam. Yes? Yes. Water to steam is a qualitative change. Change from one state of that substance to another state of that substance. Let me be very flimsy in use and very uncautious with my usage of language here. We're not talking about substances yet, but the states of this stuff. How did it do that? Increasing quantitative change. Quantitative change brings about qualitative change. That's a nodal line. It's exactly the way he's thinking about it. So we have here, of course that doesn't work. Does anybody have one?
I do actually.
Marker? Teachers in a room usually have this one. Bad teacher doesn't.
You gotta pick a class where there's 6 of them there.
I know, I usually walk in a room and look at it and make sure I have some. I didn't today. Thank you very much. I'll get it back. So you have a line, and the knots. The line is quantitative. These knots are all qualitative. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So when you have it warming up, let's say we're going this direction, you move from water as liquid to water up here as steam. You've had a qualitative change. What is that? Well, that's quality and quantity measuring one another. For a long time, the quantitative change doesn't matter. You can boil the water, it's not yet going to change into steam, but eventually it will change over. That's why he likes the nodal line sort of idea, because there is continuity here, but there's also discreteness here. Now, not discreteness just in the quantity, it's discreteness in the quality as well. The quality is changing. So the self-relations, now the many ones have a real sense, right? Here's the many ones. Because now we've got a quantitative specification of them. So now we can talk about, as he's about to say, one state versus another state versus another state. We could go down, right? Liquid, take it down this way. What are we going to get to? Eventually ice. There's the nodal line idea of the quality and quantity determining one another. It's qualitative change over against continuous quantitative change. So to be real, to be discrete now, we can say, is to be a qualitative state open to alteration. So to be, what is it to be? To be is to be real, to be burdened with negativity. Because it's burdened with negativity, it's necessarily quantitative. Because it's quantitative and that's burdened with negativity as well, it's going to change. Not such a burden now, it actually generates what these things are. And we can say that it's constant, it's in constant flux. It's one state changing into another state. But what is this thing? What's this dimension? If this is the states that are changing, then Hegel says, and this bears continuity over against these changes. It's what persists through them. Please notice, it's not what underlies them. And these states are happening to it or in it. It's changing too. But because it's changing too, it bears effects on the qualitative state. But then the qualitative state, once it gets to steam, that's now the measure, the specification for what that particular temperature is. Similarly with ice, that's what that particular temperature is. So he says, this we're entitled to call now the substrate. That which persists through change but is itself changing. That which persists through change but is itself changing. This is a relation. This is one of the things that makes it so hard to think. This is a relation between quantitative infinity and qualitative infinity. Where both are processes of surpassing and overcoming, to the smallest, to the greatest. In that way, then, you can say that the measure is set by quality every time it changes into a new state. It measures, it specifies what quantity is. What quantity is. But reciprocally, quantity sets the measure for quality by being that which is continuous and sets the boundaries within which that particular state is or is not what it is. There's their reciprocal determination of one another as processes. Both of them as processes. And that's what I want to caution us here. When he introduces the notion of substrate, Grundlagen is what the German uses. When he introduces the notion of substrate, he doesn't mean substance. He didn't all of a sudden go process, 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 and oh yeah, now we'll have substances. Doesn't happen. What does happen is two processes are in relation to one another. One of them's got continuity built into it this way, and change happens to qualities in relationship to that continuity, which is constantly in flux itself. It's constantly in a process of othering itself. So it's two processes in relation, setting the boundaries to one another. So far, so good? Sorry for the terrible graphics. Here, take a look at now, this is on 320 from the paragraph that comes over from 319. This is 365 in the German. And the paragraph that comes over from the end of that paragraph that comes over from 319. He writes, the new something has not therefore emerged out of the preceding one. It has emerged rather immediately from itself. That is, from the internal specifying unity which has not yet entered into existence. So these things are just, they look like quick transitions. We don't see that the substrate's what's underlying those changes in those states. Then he says this, and this is true on both sides. The new quality of the new something is subjected to the same progression of alteration, and so on to infinity. Now that's your, we should know this at this point, right? That's the key. That's where this is all, in a certain sense, this is what Hegel was ultimately trying to get us to see. That to be is to be real and to be quantitatively determined in both these senses. And that means that those two processes, both of them are to be thought of as processes. Processes of continually overcoming themselves and overcoming themselves to come to be themselves. But when they're in this kind of relation, they necessarily entail the relationship to one another. Now it's two processes in relationship to one another, and neither one of them gets to come to be itself in itself, because they're necessarily interrelated to one another. So the truth of being is measure, and measure is this process. A process of two processes constantly in relationship and constitutive of, productive of one another. But that means then that this could go on, and will go on, because of internally to both of those processes is what? Negation. What is it doing? It's going to overcome and overcome. So, you're going to be able to run this all the way up to infinity at the greatest level, run this down to the infinity at the lowest level. And you'll have changes in the qualitative states all the way down as well. In other words, to be measured is to be measureless. It doesn't have a boundary. It doesn't have anything that sets it on itself. This is why being is inadequate, indeterminate to itself ultimately. So take a look at what he says. This is on page 323. This is the second full paragraph down, the second paragraph under the measureless, see the measureless. The second sentence down, in the nodal lines of measures. Everybody see where I'm at? In the nodal line of measures. 323, about halfway down that page, right above 370 in the German. In the nodal line of measures is at the same time posited as specified. The abstract measureless sublates itself into qualitative determinacy. The new measure relation into which the original one passes is with respect to this measureless, but in its own self. It is self-subsistent quality. So what he's saying is that, right, quantitative turns out to have a kind of infinity about it, but that seems to be caught by or articulated by the ratio of powers. Qualitative infinity also has the structure of kind of bad or spurious infinity. That seems to be caught by the being for itself. But the problem is that they're now in relationship to one another. And they're actually not able to complete themselves in themselves, because they're always bearing a relationship to one another. So, just to put it very bluntly, quality can never be fully and completely for itself. And quantity can never be completely a raising of itself to a power, because they're always dependent on one another. He says, thus there is posited, made explicit, produced, the alternation. There's another term for, right, things are changing. So we move from becoming to alteration, now to alternation. These are all ways of thinking more deeply and more determinately what it is to become. So what we called, first of all, is the transition of being into nothing, nothing into being, the vanishing of each into one another. That's it. That's how it happens. Right? This coming into being and going out of being, that's it. Right? This is the retrogressive ground of what we were seeing at that much more abstract level as coming to being and passing away. Here's how it actually works. But here's what that in fact means. Thus there is posited the alternation of specific existences with one another, and of these also the relations remaining merely quantitative, and so on to infinity. So you have qualitative infinity, the eruption of the infinite in the finite as an immediate transitioning or passing over of the finite into its beyond. The qualitative finite becomes the infinite, he says. And quantitative infinity, the continuity of quanta into its beyond. Quantitative finite is in its own self, it's beyond, and points beyond itself. So both of them are now set up again as spurious, bad forms of infinity. But that's what's driving them is internal. The negation that transforms them, that changes them, is endemic to both. It's endemic to quality. This isn't just a quantity problem. I wish quantity would settle down and stop changing, then we could actually get quality to be okay. Quality would still change, right? Quality changes necessarily inherent to itself, so does quantity inherently change necessarily to itself. It's not a problem of one side or the other. It's a problem of both and now in relationship to one another. They can't measure, they can maybe be themselves, but they certainly can't measure one another. There's the problem. So this infinity of the specification of measures posits both the qualitative and the quantitative as sublating themselves in each other, and hence posits their first immediate unity, which is measure as such, as returned into itself, and therefore as itself posited. So take a look on, this is 5 lines down from the bottom, 5 lines up from the bottom on 323, 370 in the German, 323, 5 lines up. He says there, the qualitatively finite becomes infinite. The quantitatively finite is its beyond in it. It points beyond itself. But this, so those are the two infinities right now. We're seeing now at this level, trying to set measures on each other, and they can't. But this infinite of the specification of measure posits, makes explicit, and produces both the qualitative and the quantitative as each subletting itself in the other. So each one is taking up the other, canceling their distinctness, and integrating the other within it. And it thereby posits their first immediate unity. You always want to be careful in Hegel. First immediate is caution terms. Right? It's important. You've reached this, but you're not done. First and immediate, important, but not done. First immediate unity, which is measure in general, has returned in itself and consequently as itself positive. So that unity, this is on 324 now. This is the end of that same paragraph that came over from 323. He says, this unity which thus continues in itself in its alternating measures is the self-subsistent matter that truly persists, the fact, Sache. Now how are we to understand that? He tells you now in the next paragraph down, you have to understand that as substrate. So the persistence of the quantitative is the substrate, and persistence in its transforming of itself, right? So this line is the substrate. And then the qualitative transformations he tells you on the top of 325, 371 in the German, this is what, 1, 2, 3, it's the end of the paragraph that comes over from 324. The measures and the self-subsistent forms posited with them are consequently demoted to states. So you've got a substrate with its states. Alteration is only the mutation of a state. That's what it is. That's what change is. That's what becoming is. And that which passes over is posited as remaining the same in the mutation, remaining the same as the substrate. Now, as I said a moment ago, I just want to caution us again as we work through this. Neither one of those, neither the state nor the substrate, are things. They're not things as we classically understand them. They're not substances. They don't undergo transformation. They're not the hupakaimenon, right? That which stands under. They're not bearers of the states. That's not what the substrate is, because it's a process. And the states are a process too. What's happening here is you've got two processes intertangling with one another, intermingling with one another, determining one another. And because of that, one of them has a persistence, the quantitative, and one of them has a kind of changeability about it. That's the nodal part of the line. And that's the states, and that's the qualitative. He says, he says on 325 that those are demoted to states. So the nodes are the states, they're variable, they're like steam and liquid and ice. And the line is the substrate, it's continuous. It's like the temperature and the expansion of chemical components like hydrogen and oxygen at a higher level. Right here we're dealing with the ontological underpinnings of those particular natural chemicals. So we're not talking, this is an example, right? As I said, cautious again. This doesn't prove his case, it illustrates, if anything, what he's trying to talk about. So being then is the unity of qualitativeness and quantitativeness, which is nothing other than measure. That's what measure is. The interdependent limiting, the setting of boundaries. Think of measuring as setting of boundaries. The setting of boundaries of quality and quantity with respect to one another. So quantity sets the boundaries for ice, sets the boundaries for liquid, sets the boundary for steam, but then those actually set the boundaries of what makes that particular quantitative determination what it is. So there's how they reciprocally measure one another. But a being is at once an unchanging substrate, unchanging persistent substrate. Right? It is constantly transforming and changing, but there is a continuity of persistence about it, in which the becoming of qualitatively and quantitatively defined states takes place, the coming to being and passing away of them, the alteration of such states. The being is both the same and it's different, just to state the obvious. It is that which persists, and it's that which is other than itself. Being is therefore as substrate indifferent to the changing states that it is, and being is indifferent to its determinations. So just when you get, sort of what is being? Being is measure, where quality and quantity measure one another, both as processes, substrate and states. Then he wants to say, right, you've reached a point of what? Well, he tells you on 326, no big surprise, you've reached a state of indifference. You've reached another stage, higher stage, deeper stage, right? But stage of indifference, as he puts it here. Take a look at 326, the very first paragraph on 326, he calls this absolute indifference. Being is abstract indifference. And when this trait is to be thought by itself as being, the abstract expression indifferentness has been used, in which there is no, that's indifference in German, so he's telling you, I'm using not Gleichgültigkeit, I'm using a different term for it, to mark how absolute this is. This is the fundamental determination of being. And the fundamental determination is it's indifferent. You'll say, well, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have determination. Right, you are, it does have determination. But its determination is such that it's ultimately indifferent to its own determinateness. Oh, well then we're back with quantity. No, we're actually not. Why not? That's an important question, right? Why is being not just then, at the end of the day, magnitude? Because it has qualitative determination. Because its quantitative determination always others itself and thereby changes and transforms itself into having different states, even though its substrate persists. So he says, pure quantity is this indifference in the sense of being open to any determinations, provided that these are external to it and that quantity itself does not have any link with them originating in it. The indifference which can be called absolute, however, so there's the difference, right? Quantitative indifference is one thing. Doesn't matter what you do with it, increase or diminish its measured, its existence doesn't matter to it. But here it does matter. The indifference which can be called absolute, however, is one in which, through the negation of every determinant of being, so now negation is doing the process, doing the productive, generative work. Through the negation of every determinants of being, of quality and quantity, and of their at first immediate unity, that is of measure, mediates itself with itself to form a simple unity. Determinateness is in itself only a state, that is something qualitative external, which has the indifference as a substrate. So it's both determinate and indifferent. Being is both determinate, qualitative states, and indifferent to those determinations. It is a substrate. Now, he's going to work us through what that means and how we ought to think through that. I'm going to focus on how he unfolds from that this movement towards essence. So let me just introduce that today. We'll come back and pick this up in more detail next week and then proceed from there on into the shine, the beginning part of essence itself. Questions, or I don't want to lose anybody here. This is an important point. So. Questions, issues, problems? You're being quiet today. Come on, this stuff doesn't make any sense. Does it? I don't think so. It's nuts. Okay, I'll take that. We'll buy it for a little while. You can come back and say, I think we messed up there when we were doing this. That's right. Right. So let's think a little bit about what he does on 326 through 335. 326 through 325.
I'm sorry, could you repeat indifferent, what is it?
It's indifferent so far as the substrate is indifferent to its qualitative determinations, and the qualitative, what's determinate is the qualitative determinations.
Okay.
Yep.
So it's indifferent to the qualitative determinations?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's come to the point where, because of the way in which the quantitative infinity works, it does not matter to it, to quantitative infinity, what qualitative state it happens to be in, because it's constantly going to be changing.
Okay.
So it doesn't set a boundary or marker or border to it, limit to it. It just constantly overturns that, moves on to that.
Okay, thanks.
Now, given that the relationship of quantitative and qualitative infinity has proven to be the very core of what being is, then the whole movement of being itself, the spurious infinity of the measureless, which is the whole of being as such at this point, right? That's what he's arguing. He's arguing that to be is to be measureless. That's literally the conclusion of the doctrine of being. To be is to be measureless. Being stands in contradiction with itself. And as a result, being is unable to determine itself in terms of its own governing movement, a movement that's endemic to it, immanent to it, a true or genuine form of infinity that would be endemic or intrinsic to being itself. Normally we would say, okay, you got this substrate state thing, come on, tell us about how there's, circular form of infinity that binds the two together, and that's how this all works, and it's all glorious and wonderful. And Hegel says, I'd love to, but it doesn't work that way. It's just not there. The two processes are not reconciled with one another within the dimension of being. It's just not possible. It doesn't work that way. It works in qualitative infinity, works in quantitative infinity, but doesn't work in terms of measure. Measure is measureless. There is no bad form of measurelessness and good form of measurelessness. There's just measurelessness. So to be an entity, to be is to be real is to be an entity. I'm just summarizing the doctrine of being at this point. To be is to be real is to be an entity. To be an entity is to be measure, where to be a measure is to be both qualitatively determined and quantitatively determined. But what if it is, it is to be fundamentally is to be measured? And if this is to be qualitative states that are open to the effects of quantitative change, in other words, to be is to be a nodal line, that's not just true of water, right? That's true of, this is Hegel's claim, ontologically, that's true of everything. Every entity is that, because the whole of being is that. But if what it is to be fundamentally is to be measured, and if this is to be qualitative states that are open to the effects of quantitative change, that is to say a nodal line, then the graduated leaps of transformation are open to infinite increase and infinite decrease. Qualitative determination and quantitative determination are then not genuine measures of one another, for they do not sufficiently set boundaries to one another. The boundaries that each set are limits that prove to be constrictions of alteration. Such a condition is the measureless. What follows from that? Well, he says that that state of substrate and states is what he calls a self-sublating contradiction. Self-sublating contradiction. He calls it at first on 330. He says this, and we'll have to work up to what these things mean, but here's at least the passages where he makes this claim. He says on 330, just above the remark, this is 376 in the German, this unity thus posited as the totality of the process of determining, itself determined in this process as indifference, is a contradiction all around. It must therefore be posited, made explicit but also produced, as this self-sublating contradiction, and be determined as subsistence existing for itself, one which no longer has a merely indifferent unity for result, but a unity eminently negative and absolute. This is essence. Now, I don't know about you, but I never defined essence that way. I defined essence as what it is to be of something. Right? What those sets of properties, those sets of features, those elements, whatever attributes that make something what it is. That's essence. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Essence is, I don't know what that just said, but it's not that. He says this then. Take a look on 334. Take a look on 334, first full paragraph down, 382, first full paragraph down. And this is the paragraph we'll come back and worry over with all or much of next session, right, of next week. He says, but this self-sublation of the determination of indifference has already manifested itself. In the progressive positing of its being, it has shown itself on all sides to be contradiction. So there's that same notion of there's something in tension with one another. Two sides are in tension with one another. What are the two sides? Qualitative states, quantitative substrate. Those are in tension with one another. In some way, form, fashion, or another. They're in tension, contradiction with one another. Indifference is in itself the totality in which all the determinations of being are sublated and contained. Thus, it is the substrate, Grundlage. But at first only in the one-sided determination of being in itself. So the substrate is at first, what we've already seen of it, is it's the in itself, right? It's that which holds while the qualitative changes happen in it. And he says, but at first only in the one-sided determination of being in itself. And consequently the differences, the quantitative differences, the inverse ratio of factors, are present in it as external. So it's like it persists, and all this stuff is happening in it, but it's persisting. We haven't yet got to substance, right? But we're closer than we've been before. Right?
perduring, at least, without time. As thus the contradiction of itself in its determinateness, of its implicitly existent determination, and of its positive determinateness, he's still talking about the substrate. So this, it is the negative totality whose determinacies have internally sublated themselves. What does that mean? What's happened to the substrate? Right? What's going on with this? Consequently, have also sublated the one-sidedness of their substrate. Their in itselfness. And difference now positive, what in fact is simple and infinitely negative self-relation. The incompatibility of itself with itself. The repelling, he goes back and grabs that language again. The repelling of itself from itself. Determining and being determined are not a transition, übergehen, right? It's not the going over one side of the other, nor an external alteration. He's telling you, this isn't like anything you've seen before, right? This isn't like becoming, which we've met up with before, being into nothing. And it's not like alteration, which you've seen in qualitative terms, you've seen it in quantitative terms. It's not like either one of those, what's happening here. Something's fundamentally different about this. Nor again an emergence of determinations in it. It's not something that sustains and then these things arise and emerge in it, which is what the nodal line sounds like. But its own relating to itself, which is the negativity of itself, the negativity of its in itselfness. Now, if you get nothing else out of that, and we'll try to get much more out of that next week, he's at least saying this. The substrate looks like it was indifferent to the states, its qualitative states changing. That's our first understanding of it. But when you start to look at it, and you start to think about their relationship to one another, you begin to realize, no, that substrate is not indifferent at all. That substrate's doing something. What it's doing, let's leave it open. It's at least, right? It's at least quantitative transformation. It's at least that. Because we know the substrate is the quantitative line going through, right? So, okay, fine. But it seems like it's initially indifferent to its qualitative states, the change in it. So it doesn't care about them. But it absolutely does care about them. Why? Because it's got negation, not only transforming from one moment in the quantitative change, but changing outside of it as well. In other words, there's negativity between the qualitative and the quantitative. That's at least what he seems to be saying there. Next paragraph down. But as so repelled, that's important because he's linking it back up to what I just talked about, is that repelling of substrate from itself. It's got negation of itself. So that means it's no longer just going to stay. That's why it's a negation of its in itselfness. It's not going to stay in its indifferent, perduring state. It's actually what generates those qualitative changes. But as so repelled, the determinations are not self-possessed. The qualitative states he's talking about now. They're not self-possessed. They're not just riding up there on top of the quantitative change all alone by themselves. And, we were once liquid, now we're steam, now we're ice again. No. The determinations are not self-possessed, do not emerge as self-subsistent or external, but are rather as moments. And that's loaded language, right? That means they're moments of something else. That's what a moment always indicates, right? A moment always belongs to, dependent on something of which it is the product or the element within. So he unpacks this. So he's just, he knows what he's just done. He just said something pretty significant. They are as moments. So what does that mean? First, he says, as belonging to the unity whose existence is still only implicit. They are not let go by it, but rather born by it as their substrate and are filled by it alone. So here's where the substrate bears the qualitative transformation. So it was indifferent to those changes, now it's bearing them. That's an upping of the ante of how it relates to them. It's no longer just indifferent to them, it contains them. But it doesn't stop there. In that sense, there are moments of it, right? They're dependent on it as that which bears them. But remember, that which is bearing them, the substrate, is a process itself. So he hasn't all of a sudden introduced the thing that stands underneath them. He's saying there's a process going on here at the quantitative level that now holds on and bears the qualitative state's change. Is that measure? No, we're not getting measure out of that just yet. But we're at least getting it a place for them to reside. He then says, and second, as determinations, immanent to the unity as it exists for itself, they are only through their repulsion from themselves. They are only through their repulsion from themselves. Who's repulsing who? What's going on? He explains a little bit. Instead of some existent or other, as they are in the whole sphere of being, they now are simply and solely as positive. So now they become explicit, right, as states of something else, where that something else is itself a process. What's the process? It's the process that engenders them. It repulses itself and thereby engenders them. So now the negation is between the substrate and the states themselves. That's at least what he seems to be saying. And that posits them, it produces them. That's the way you need to hear that both. With the sole determinate significance of being, and here's where I really refer, related to their unity, and hence to the other and to negation, marked by this, their relativity. Now, relativity is a term he's not used up to this point in the text. He's 300 and something pages in, and he's now decided to, look, we've got a relativity going here. What's that? We've been talking about relationality all the time. So it can't be just simply they're related to one another. Relativity here has got to mean something more than just that. Well, look at what he says in the next paragraph. I would suggest to you that already he's connecting relativity to repulsion. He wants to think those two things together. Relativity is a name for him of the negation of the substrate of itself that engenders the states, the qualitative states and their changes. He says on the top of page 335, being in general and the being or immediacy of the different determinacies have thereby vanished just as much as the in itselfness, and the unity is being immediately presupposed totality, so that it is only this simple self-relating mediated by the sublation of this presupposition. And this presupposedness, the immediate being, is itself only a moment of its repelling. The original self-subsistence and self-identity are only as the resulting infinite self-rejoining. So here's now the substrate repelling from itself and engendering, producing thereby qualitative transformation and coming to be itself only in that moment. And now if you stop right there, you might want to say, oh, okay, now we finally get it. Quantity does everything, right? Because that's quantitative. That's quantitative change, right? So the substrate seems to be doing a lot of work now. It generates literally all the qualitative changes that are being, as I just said, it's the entirety of being that's being generated here. So you might say, well, there it is, finally, we get the answer. Quantity is most important. But look at what he says about it. And so is being determined as essence. When substrate generates states, by virtue of its negation of itself, when it engenders, when it posits states and their transformations, then we don't really think of this as the substrate indifferent to its states. We think of them as now engendering, because this is the truth. It's engendering those states. Then we've got repulsion going from here to here, and that's what makes that thing what it is. Now we've got a sense of infinity as circular, self-relating infinity. It's here, between those two moments. But then the substrate's no longer quantitative. The substrate in that moment is essence. This is existence. That's why we can't be in being anymore. Because the substrate does something that a quantitative substrate alone can't do. It transforms itself, it engenders, and thereby produces qualitative states themselves. That's why he will say, and so is being determined as essence, being which through the sublation of being, through its own transformation of itself, all this is being. Essence didn't show up from someplace else and go, I see you guys are having a problem. I see that, the quantitative and the qualitative, you guys can't get along, so let me help you guys get along. I'm going to make things simpler for you. I'm going to set up a relationship, a hierarchy between them. That's not what happens. According to Hegel, essence is being sublation of itself. Being sublation of itself. It is the ground of being. It is the truth of being. It's the result of being. But it's what being imminently and necessarily unfolds into as unfolding of itself. So is being determined as essence, being which through the sublation of being is simple being with itself. Now think about that claim for just a moment. We'll go back and unpack the details, and I'll try to lead you precisely through the argument as it works here. I'm just trying to outline it here very quickly. But think about what that last line is. That's really kind of interesting. Being is only with itself when it's not being. That's literally what that says. Right? Being is only with itself. Being only comes to be itself. Despise itself language. Means it's with itself, but it's with itself properly at home with itself. It becomes itself. Being is itself, not in qualitative determination, not in quantitative determination. As important as those things are, they are definitive of what it is to be. So never back off of that. He's not saying all that was a ruse, all that was a lie, all that was illusion. He's not saying that. He's saying all these determinations are real about being. But not a bit of that makes being be what it is. What makes being be what it is that being not be being. Is that it be grounded, term we'll use later for this, but it's relative to, the term he's about to use for it, which will get us really screwed up, is reflected back into, right? Something other than itself. That something other than itself is essence. But that otherness didn't come from outside. It's right here already on the scene. Essence is not external to being until it is. Because it has to be, to account for the qualitative and quantitative determination of being. But then it's no longer in being itself. So being comes to be with itself, comes properly to be itself, only when it's related to that which is other than it, to which it transforms itself into. Being is being only insofar as being is essence. Essence is not a being. Essence is not qualitative determination. Essence is not quantitative determination. Essence is not the measure of quality and quantity with one another. It comes out of that analysis, but it's not equivalent to any of that. It's what sets the measure. Put it in that language. It's what sets the measure on being. But it comes from within being to do that. So it is simple being with itself. Being that sublated itself is being that comes to be itself. All right. Let me leave it there. Questions, issues, problems you can't possibly believe all that's correct. Either as an interpretation of the text or just true. Sophie, did you have your hand up?
Yes, but like this, we'll go for the very first chapter, and because it seems that the work of negativity has been replicated in every stage or at every moment was made possible from the very beginning, assuming that pure nothing has a meaning, and then equating it with pure being, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, we speak that way, but
Yeah.
to be more precise, we would say that pure nothing is pure being.
Yes.
Because it is, though it's vacuous and empty and has no determination.
Yeah, but like
But just to state that one, but if pure nothing is, then yes, you're exactly right. A lot, arguably everything up to here, follows from that
Yes.
momentous claim.
Yeah, but like to say that because pure nothing is, then we equate it with pure being.
Yeah, then it's non-being, right? It's not pure nothingness.
Yeah, but like this presupposes that language is a kind of a fully formed system of referentialities that can grasp everything.
Mhm.
So, but we can't say nothing about nothing, because I'm thinking of Heidegger's like thought about the apis,
Mhm.
the as the non, like the bottomless.
Yeah.
So when we talk about nothing, we can't speak of it because we can't grasp it in its totality. It's just because of deficiency in language that nothing is, or pure nothing is. But this is presupposed by Hegel, that
Right.
language can grasp being in its totality.
Or it looks like it
Yeah.
can, but then it falsely suggests to us that we've actually got it and that it is because of that.
Yeah.
Yep. So a couple of things to say about that. I think that's a really important insight, right? Heidegger famously tells us, right, the nothing nothings, right? And that's him trying to, as far as I can tell, capture what the nothing does, right? And and for him, in and through the work of concealment. It's the lethe and every aletheia, right? So we know this kind of story about concealment and unconcealment. But Hegel wants to say, well, just as much as you can make that declaration that the nothing nothings, that it works in this way, that it conceals in order to reveal. In saying that, we are saying that nothing is. Language is not impoverished to that extent. It can say that. And it can say that because that's what it is. It actually is grasping the nature of reality at that point. It's saying nothing does exist. Now you say nothing nothings, and that means you say nothing nothings, and therefore you can't say anything more about it. Right? The concealing is hidden itself. This is the problem of the Castell. I mean, the whole account of technology flows out of that. But Hegel wants to say, when you say that it is, when you're saying that it nothings, you're saying that it is. That's my point. We're done. I don't need anything more than that. So it is. And insofar as it is, then it's being. It's not everything, right? But it's being. And if that's the case, then being is necessarily burdened with, afflicted with, infected with the product of negation. Not nothing, not the nothing nothings, but negation. Determinate negation, which is not what the nothing nothings means. That's just always a concealing that somehow or another various forms of unconcealment arise out of. So Hegel wants to say that presupposing, so this is the way he would put it, presupposing that language can't grasp that is a dogmatic presupposition. If you put aside all, it's a dogmatic presupposition because it says thought's not up to being. Being extends beyond. Being's ineffable in some way, so being, I'm being caricatures now, but being's beyond thought. And Hegel wants to say, says who? Why? I mean, I know we'd like to be humble and say that being is not, graspable fully by thought. I understand that he's saying. I get that. That's what philosophia has always meant. It's meant we're after being, but we never get there. It's the love of wisdom, but not the actual attainment thereof. And he says, let's see if we can actually attain it. He claims that there are two ways, at least, by which you can show this, that you do. One's to go through the phenomenology route to prove this and attain absolute knowing, which you always already had to have, or you couldn't even have sense certainty. That's the argument of that book. Or you can say, I'll set aside all presuppositions, including the one that says thought's not up to being. And then you have thought and being are one. And so to say the nothing is to say that it is just to say what thought knows about being. I grant you that's incredibly frustrating, but I do think that there is something to Hegel's point that to insist, I'm not saying you are, but to insist that the nothing is beyond articulation is itself a dogmatic presupposition that's unsubstantiated, other than appeals to things like.
The same can be said for his presupposition that language is a fully formed system of referentiality.
He clearly owes us, I absolutely grant you this, he clearly owes us an account of, is language up to this task? Is language, part of the system is going to have to be, you're going to have to show us that the very tool by which you construct the system is up to the task of constructing the system. Part of which is language up to doing this kind of explanatory work and articulation work? I grant you that, absolutely. I'll try to address that at the end because I think that's the appropriate place to do that, but I do want to stay with it. But his claim is that language is, here's the basic thesis, right? Systematic language, speculative language, is defined by is possible because language is not fully exhausted in its referentiality. We think it is. We think language is fully and completely representational, that it speaks of things outside it in some form, fashion, or another. He says it absolutely does that. This is Hegel, right? It's in the philosophy of subjective spirit. It absolutely does that. But it doesn't just do that. It does something more than that. It does something that we call connecting terms and concepts together. And that's by virtue of the mind being able to do that. It just connects these concepts together. And it doesn't even have to refer to anything out in the world. He calls this mechanical memory. You can just put things together. put concept after concept after concept, string them together. It doesn't have to have any reference at all to the external world. They just have to have, it's like rote memory, like we say. You don't associate that to anything. It's just this goes, then that goes next, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, those kinds of things. We just have rote memory about those. And he says we can do that. That's what language is ultimately capable of. What binds them together? What binds them together is the logic internal to the mind itself. What's the logic that's internal to the mind itself? That logic. So it's able to express the very logic that is its ultimate grammar, its ultimate syntax. That's what this is. But that's a bigger argument to be made, right? But that's the kind of, you're exactly right. He would have to show us that there is such a thing as speculative language, and in particular speculative grammar, and that the entirety of the system, not just the logic, but certainly the logic, operate by virtue of that. And one of the things that would have to be true of that is, number one, the thought in being a one, and number two, that representation is not the full function of language itself. That language, maybe in its most fundamental function, is about relationality between concepts, rather than those concepts pointing out to the world in some form or fashion. Does that make at least some, that doesn't really address the ultimate answer to the
I
question.
have to wait until the end.
Yeah, but that's, I think this is the right question to ask, right? What's the condition of the possibility? One of the conditions of the possibility of the system is language that's not fully and completely representational. Yeah, Alex.
While we're on the subject of language, I have a somewhat related question. Maybe somewhat related. So now that we've worked our way into the system a little bit, it's really striking to see how these really huge philosophical terms that have attained such a kind of determinate sense, sometimes debated over, but a more or less kind of stable sense in the course of Western philosophy, receive a very new one as they unfold dialectically here.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, does Hegel anywhere provide a more or less sustained account of what leads him to opt for certain terms as opposed to others? Because he could, I suppose, think, well, you know what, just inventing a bunch of neologisms would be better, right? Because that doesn't have all this baggage.
Yeah. I've been my own glossary of Hegel terms, right?
Yeah, exactly, right.
Substitute for all this stuff.
Yeah, you could just, a new book, we can all just flip through
Right.
page 2,000.
Get rid of quality,
We're
get
good.
rid of quantity, get rid of substrate, put in these new
Right.
better terms for them.
Yeah, less loaded,
Yeah.
traditionally.
Well, because they're
loaded terms.
neologisms, right? They can be
Right,
all.
right. So, and you kind of see these two tendencies in philosophy from time to time.
Yeah.
Our language is so bogged down by
Yeah.
the traditional understanding of things that we need to just make a new one.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if Hegel ever really addresses that. I mean, some of the remarks kind of touch on that
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah,
but-
and he's acknowledging that there's a, underlying being is a notion of permanentity, is an underlying nothing, is something like,
Right, exactly.
Buddhism, something like that,
Well, what's interesting too is how the sense of these terms develops in the movement of their unfolding.
Yeah.
As opposed to static, here's the glossary entry and
Right.
then.
Yeah, yeah.
right, So,
So, here's what I would say about that. I mean, does he ever lay this out fully and completely? I think the answer to that is no. What he will say, so let me talk about what he will say about it, and then try to expound a little bit on that from the actual practice, so infer from the practice. What he will say is that, what we have to do is set aside all presuppositions, let the matter itself, die Sache selbst, unfold in its own self, and then our job is to find, as it unfolds, the proper term to use for what it unfolds itself into. So if it others itself, which they do, then insofar as they make that transformation, what do we term it? And also be careful not to term it something too much, right? But to term it what's appropriate to what's transformed itself into. And then we're taking that term and we're elevating it obviously to a concept. Does that concept come with baggage? That's your question, right? And why not just invent a new term? That'd be one proposal, rather than go down the baggage route, because that has all that baggage, right? Confusion comes out of that. So I've said this before, but let me just say it again to make the contrast that I want to draw out of it. If you ask someone like Gadamer, he would say that's exactly what Hegel does. He picks these terms because of their baggage, and he wants to say what all that baggage brings along with it, right? So when he's saying Werden, he's saying becoming, we all know that's the becoming of something. So he wants all that to come along with it. I don't think this text sustains that reading, right? But it's at least plausible, right? He's doing a kind of, highly abstract, meta-level history of philosophy, right? And that's really what the logic is a kind of surreptitious history of philosophy. That's one way of, and Gadamer literally says that kind of stuff about this. It makes sense, right? How can we, he's a hermeneutic, how can we make sense of these things? They have historical vestiges and baggage that come along with them, so we can use those to make sense of these things. That's how we make sense of Hegel. But Hegel doesn't operate that way. Hegel tends to say, here's what that term is, here's what it really means. So he thinks he's getting at what the philosophical meaning of the term is. Think about substrate, for example. Right? And he wants to say, I know you're going to think that's supercombinant, but it's not. It's not subjectum, it's not those things. Because it's a process, and that's frustrating to us, because that's not what subjectum meant, that's not what supercombinant meant, right? Or at least on typical readings of Aristotle and others. So he says, no, that's not what it meant. But there is a kernel they're right about. So that's that kernel thing he's holding on to. That's why he thinks the term is worth using, rather than a neologism. Because he wants to say there's something right? There was an insight there. Aristotle, Parmenides, Heraclitus, Descartes, Nicholas of Cusa, whoever, right? They had something that they were onto. And yeah, they didn't think it in its full breadth and depth and sophistication that was there for the offering. It's actually there in it. They didn't go all those ways with it, but they could have, because it was on offer here. They just didn't follow it out. They were insufficiently, this is the kind of brutal way Hegel thinks about this stuff, they were insufficiently philosophical. Right? They were not satisfied with, they were not patient enough to stay with the imminent unfolding of those concepts. They get to a certain point and go, yeah, that's enough, let's do this, basically. Right? So his cheap shot at Aristotle, which he's not the first nor the last to make, is, let's just understand this in terms of production. Form on matter, there we go. That'll make, and Hegel's wanting to say, why would you take that as your measure, right? Why not look at the imminent unfolding of the thing? You had it there, right? Why not look at the imminent unfolding of this? He thinks the same is true as Kant, by the way. He doesn't think he was too much. Nobody escapes this charge, really, for him. But that's why he thinks that you want to retain these terms, even though they have these problematic baggages, and makes them, he's constantly working with and against the tradition in that sense. But it's with the tradition that gives him, he thinks, that it tethers it to an understanding that makes it possible for this to be both familiar terms. So you're going to look at this book and you're going to go, if you're a Kantian, you're going to go quality, quantity, relation, modality, got it. And he's going to say, you think you got it, but let's work through this. You're going to go in here and think you're Aristotelian or Cartesian or whatever else, and you're going to think, I know what that is. And he's going to say, right, you think you know what it is, but let's work on that and see if that's really what it is. Because the question here is not, what does history tell us? The question here is, what does the matter itself tell us? Does that help with why these terms get elevated to these concepts?
Yeah,
a bit.
Yeah, it's a very interesting aspect of this.
I think it's a way of acknowledging an indebtedness to the tradition without being determined, and I mean that necessitarian sense here, determined by that tradition. It's inheritance of that tradition, and he is quite clear that language has abilities in it already that we don't need to make up new things for it, although you might wonder, some of this sounds like he's making this a whole different language up. Germans will read this and go, I don't think that's in German, right? Problems like that. And I get that, but what I think he's trying to do is articulate the nature of thought and the nature of the matter itself. And to be able to do that in a way that works is to hold on to certain kind of terms that have a baggage, but work with that baggage, let you think that, and then work against that baggage to see what that term actually entails against that baggage itself. Or affirms about that baggage, right? Sometimes he wants to say, no, that captures some things really here, and he'll say it captures them. But the ultimate measure of that is not the history. It's the unpacking of the imminent unfolding of the determinations themselves. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Nicola.
I think I need some help understanding why there are two processes when it comes to node align and why it isn't one process?
Good question. So there are two processes because one's quantitative infinitizing, the other is qualitative infinitizing, right? So what we've seen is that these qualities change because quality born in itself has negation and overcomes any kind of self-relation, so that changes of itself. So that's one, let's call it dimension of, it's one process into itself, that's the claim. And then quantitative infinity is what makes this line be what it is, right? It's othering of the line, it's the discreteness and continuity of the line. So there's your two infinitizing processes. They can be thought of as having a kind of, not just kind of, a self-relation unto themselves. That'd be the true infinity of quality and the true infinity of quantity. But what he's pointing out is that when they try to measure one another, they don't have that kind of self-relation between them. That transforms the substrate-state relationship into something other than that. It transforms it into the essence being or essence existence relationship. That's going to be the bigger claim. But that's the two that are not just one
Yeah,
process.
I'm asking because it seems like you need, like they necessitate one another or co-constitute one another in such a way that it feels like having two processes that, like, I don't understand how they can have an independence in that way. That's where I'm.
So they don't have an absolute independence. I'm glad you asked about this, because this is a really, really good point. And I've struggled with this too, so I share your sort of frustration about how does this exactly work. So the best I can do with it is this. I can say that the qualitative infinity and quantitative infinity, the state changing and the quantitative change, are parallel processes, parallel coordinated processes. That's why he wants to call them nodal lines. The line goes through, but the nodes are changing, right? So the nodes change, that's the parallelism between the two. And what, in being itself, what can't work there is that one of the processes measures adequately the other process, because they'll go off to infinity, each one of them. So there's no boundary setting, there's no specifying, there's no limitation of one by the other. Neither qualitative infinity nor quantitative infinity. So far, so good? So the parallel is really the key thing. That's the claim, is that they're dependent on one another. They're reciprocally determining of one another. But precisely that reciprocal determination is ultimately, starts off by being measured, but it fails to measure. It's a measure that is supposed to specify, he said. That is, set out the parameters within which something is what it is. That's what specifying measure is supposed to do. But it doesn't do that. It fails at that. That's why the measure is measureless. So you have a spurious infinity of measure here. So measure is measureless. But it's only when you have this infinity between them that you do have an actual measure, right, that works for both of them. It sets the measure from both sides. But that means that the substrate's no longer a substrate anymore. It's something other than that, something more than that. It's essence. And that changes the states into something other, more than what they were. It changes them into existence. More about that next week. But that's the two processes problem, which I've struggled with for a long time, because when you see the nodal line, first you want to say, oh, they're one process. Two manifestations of the same process, quality, two manifestations of the same process going on. But that's not what's happening, right? It's actually two processes. Is that useful?
Yes, thank you.
I don't want you guys to miss your Nietzsche documentary. Much more interesting than nodal lines and Hegel. Come on. Who doesn't want will to power? Maybe that is will to power, I don't know. You good? Other questions? All right. Thank you, guys. I pushed you pretty hard tonight. I appreciate it. I'll see you next week. I'll push you even harder. Right? So do the reading for next week, and we'll be to Essence next week. Thanks.